Well, hey, gang, as we get to Daniel 7, we are entering a place of much controversy. We obviously see Daniel seeing historical events, things that happened not in Daniel's time, but between Daniel's time and the time of Christ. Some would say that that is all we see. Some would say no, some of this applies to stuff before Christ and some of this applies to stuff during Christ's lifetime. Still others would say no, the majority of this is are events and leaders that refer to future things. And look, there is some utility in trying to match all of these beasts and creatures with the work of John in the book of Revelation, and then also to look around at the geopolitical landscape and say, man, it sure seems like the things that are happening in Daniel, we see things like that happening around our world. And it's not that there's not utility for that, but we can get so wrapped up in trying to match the Daniel's dream with world events that we can miss the big idea entirely. Remember, this was something that meant a lot to Daniel in Daniel's time. And here is, so let's look at a couple of chapters at a time, and instead of trying to decide what's going to happen in the future, let's look at what is happening eternally. And let's see if we can't, like Daniel, grow in confidence of the power of God that exists and is victorious and is with us, even if we look around and say, man, this looks like Babylon. Interesting that Daniel is writing in the time of Babylon, in fact, still a Babylonian king. And we're kind of going back in time. Remember, King Darius is the king that threw Daniel in the lion's den. King Belshazzar, that was the last of the Babylonian kings, was the guy who saw the handwriting on the wall. And we are headed back into that season of the Babylonian Empire to hear these stories. Chapter 7 starts with, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. So these are visions that Daniel had while Babylon was at its height. And it is interesting that Babylon the Great is the backdrop for much of the book of Revelation. That we are supposed to say, look, Babylon was not only a particular kingdom, but it was a type of kingdom that we still see today. A rebellious, idolatrous, not honoring God, rather honoring itself, its own power, its own, glory, its own opulence. Babylonian was like that. Greece was like that. Rome was like that. We could look around and say, in all of human history, there have been great kingdoms that were opposed to God. And in some way, we would look and say, actually, Babylon, the core of like the caring about my glory instead of God's, is in the heart of every human. That we would say, look, this is something that every kingdom has to deal with, also that every human has to deal with, that the offers before you are Babylon and the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of your glory and your opulence and your comfort, or the kingdom of sacrifice and actual love and joy and peace that does not come from the outside in, but rather comes from the inside out. As we live wholeheartedly, we become the living sacrifices in the kingdom of God. So the lessons that Daniel is teaching always matter. In every time, it mattered when Daniel wrote them in the book of Daniel. It mattered as Babylon is the world power. It mattered when the Medes and the Persians took over. It mattered when Greece took over. It mattered when Rome took over. It has always mattered that we have the question as we look around and go, man, it is hard to see the power of God in the culture I'm in. It is easy to see the glory of opulence and wealth and comfort and whatever. Babylon is all around me. Is God still powerful? So Daniel in chapter 7 has these visions of these four beasts. And again, they're terrible, horrible, all in their own way. These are beasts that are relate to Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the statue. Lots of information out there about who in particular all these beasts would be, but I would like to draw your attention to verse 9. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. Clearly, just these images of light and fire that always accompany the presence of God in the Old Testament. Thousands upon thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. So even though these beasts are powerful, when God comes on the scene, it's different. And I think one of the big ideas in the book of Daniel is always going to be kings are going to fight. There's going to be wars. There's going to be power struggles, and there's going to be wins and losses, and there's going to be terror, and there's going to be difficulty, and there's going to be struggle as people try to fight to be the top of the heap. But when God shows up, it is very clear who the Ancient of Days is, who the King of the universe is. And it isn't a human. It's God himself. And I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over and burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. It is just so clear that as these men, as these beasts fight for power, it is God that gives dominion and takes it away. It is God that everyone answers to. Whether we're talking about Napoleon or a king of an empire somewhere, or a president, or a pastor, or whoever you're thinking about as like struggling for power, they will all stand before the King of Glory. It is God who gives dominion. It is God who takes away dominion. And if you are Daniel in the middle of the height of Babylon and you think, where are the promises of God? Is God going to be faithful to his people? Do the covenants matter still? Oh, yes. God's promises are sure. He is not threatened by the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms, but his kingdom is everlasting. Keep reading in verse 13. And I saw in the night vision, so again, Daniel's having dreams, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. Son of man is one of Jesus' favorite titles for himself. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. So not just the Jewish nation. This is Old Testament stuff, giving us the understanding that when the Son of Man comes on the scene, this will not be one of these temporary, for some people kind of kingdoms, but this will be for the entire globe. Every language, every ethnos, every people group will be involved. And look at what will typify his kingdom. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So like I said, there's some utility and there's a lot of fun in going through here and trying to figure out who the fourth kingdom is and how much of this stuff is future and how much of this stuff was past. But we can get so in those weeds that we miss Daniel's point entirely. Men are going to rise and fall. Kingdoms are going to rise and fall. But dominion, power, authority belongs to Jesus and Jesus alone. We are going to represent him in all kinds of kingdoms as long as he should tarry. Until he comes back, there will be kingdoms that honor God more and honor God less. There will be selfish, cruel leaders, and hopefully every once in a while we get a kind, generous leader. But the dominion is an everlasting dominion that belongs to our King, Jesus. So I bet if you were living under the reign of Belshazzar, who was this terrible, idolatrous, arrogant, leader, I bet a vision that reminded you that guy thinks he's in charge, but it's actually God who is the Ancient of Days. God is the consuming fire. God is the one who has dominion, and it is an everlasting kingdom that the Son of Man has established. The first Christians looked at Daniel, and as Jesus came and said, the kingdom of God is near, they looked at what Daniel had written and said, this is what we're seeing, an everlasting kingdom being established. So would you live in the peace and joy of that everlasting kingdom instead of the worry and fear of the rise and fall of kingdoms that we have on the earth now and will always have? Let's serve him. Let's have confidence in him. And let's rejoice that we are citizens, not just of kingdoms that come and go, but of an everlasting kingdom of love and joy and peace and victory. All right, Lighthouse, be loved.